I'm done now. I feel like I need to I literally need to feel like I need to, okay, so we've been practicing that, as you can tell. And I have to tell you some funny parts from our practicing, reading this scripture presentation, because the children really paid attention to some very specific parts, because they're textual scholars. So first of all, it has been a whole thing about voting for who will be what parts, and the siblings voting for each other to be the one who was robbed and who would do the robbing. So, but the part that got the most attention and practice were two parts. First of all, are we really going to strip naked the person who is robbed and left on the side of the road? No, we are not. I put the kibosh on that quickly. We're not actually going to strip anybody naked. We're not going to actually hit anybody. We're not going to bite anybody. We're not going to do any of that. We're acting it out. So you're welcome. The other part that got a lot of attention was the oil and the wine. Are we going to pour oil and wine? Also, quickly, no. No, we're not going to pour oil and wine on anybody, actual oil and wine, because of the complete bonkers disaster that would be. So again, you're also welcome for that. But we talked about it. So I tell you, when we got to the part about are we going to strip somebody naked in the worship service, the kids just erupted in hysterics. And I really had a moment of thinking, like, really, Jesus? Why you got to put that in there? Like, can I leave it out? Maybe I should just not read that part. Maybe, is that important? Maybe I don't need to do it. And when we discuss Bible stories with the kids, though, we talk about that every word is important, that every word is essential, and that our biblical authors are not writing this down on a laptop, and there's no luxury of having extra throwaway words to write down. Every word's important. So why did we need to know that he was stripped naked and left for dead on the side of the road? I think it was so that we would know, as the readers of this story, that the people who were passing by had no idea who the man was who was left for dead. In a region where there are lots of differences, political, geographic, communities are very different, but they don't necessarily look different. What you wore and how you talked would have been primary ways to tell who people are. And are they my people, or are they my enemies? And so Jesus wants us to know that that person who was left for dead could have been anybody. It could have been a priest, another priest. It could have been someone who was just at the temple. It could have been a Roman. It could have been a Gentile. It could have been a Jewish person. It could have been anybody. They don't know who he is. Also that he's unconscious and left for dead, right? They don't see what he's wearing, and they can't hear him talk. So they have no idea to determine whether are these my people? Is this my person? So why didn't the priest stop? Let's talk a little bit about the stakes of stopping. If the priest had stopped to help and the man was dead, the priest would have been considered ritually impure and considered unclean, and would have had to go through, before having contact with a dead body, and would have had to go through a ritual to be considered clean. And he would have been out of work as a priest. You can't work as a priest if you're considered ritually impure. He would have had to stand with those people in the temple who are considered ritually impure. And he would have had to sacrifice a red heifer and burn it till it turned to ash. Now, Curtis and Cheryl can tell you that I went down a rabbit hole this week on the internet about whether anyone actually burned a red heifer or not. And I don't recommend this rabbit hole. It takes you to some apocalyptic places about, is there a red heifer somewhere in Montana right now? And I went down all those rabbit holes. And needless to say, it's super complicated. They may have only ever burned 9 red heifers from the time of Moses till the Second Temple. So whether any of that is true on the internet or not, I can't vouch for it. But I will say, they weren't turning around burning red heifers every other week in Israel. And it was a super complicated process for a priest to go from being ritually unclean to clean. Huge issue. Okay, so maybe that's why the priest didn't stop. Why didn't the Levite stop? Did he see the priest not stop? Was he also afraid of becoming ritually impure if that man was dead? Or was he afraid that man who was dead was bait for another attack? that he would be ambushed and he would be killed. That road from Jerusalem to Jericho is a dangerous road. It steeply descends and is windy. Martin Luther King Jr. in I've Been to the Mountaintop that he wrote on April 3rd, 1968, the day before his assassination, described seeing this road when he and Mrs. King traveled to Jerusalem. He said, "I can see why Jesus used this as the setting for his parable. It's a winding, meandering road. It's really conducive for ambushing. It's a dangerous road." Okay, so maybe they didn't stop because they didn't want to be killed. Fair, right? Maybe they thought the man was a Gentile, or worse, maybe they thought that man who had been robbed was a Samaritan. The political situation in first century Palestine was just as complicated politically as our own time. The Jews didn't like the Gentile pagans, and they hated the Samaritans, The Jews and the Samaritans had been fighting since the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BCE by the Assyrians. The Samaritans are first mentioned in the book of Nehemiah for disagreeing with Nehemiah, who had returned from Babylonian exile a couple hundred years later, and he was looking to rebuild the temple. The Samaritans were the descendants of the poor people in Israel who were not taken into exile. And they were already considered ritually impure, and a mix of ethnicities that was frowned upon. And just basically, the Jewish population thought the Samaritans were doing the worship thing all wrong. Also then, back to Nehemiah, they had offered to help rebuild the temple, and the Jews said, "No, we don't want your help," and then everybody got mad about that. Samaritans set up their own temple near Shechem at Mount Gezrim, and then the Jews later on attacked and destroyed that temple, and then the Samaritans scattered human bones, and you already know from the whole red heifer business how they feel about being ritually impure because of dead bodies. So it was complicated and messy. They hated each other. We live in a complicated world with political, ethnic, and cultural differences, much like first century Palestine. We are divided in our country along geographic, cultural, ethnic, political, generational lines. We start putting everybody in stereotypical straitjackets. Baby boomers all act one way. They won't retire. They got all the houses. Gen X is acting another way. We think we're all disaffected and we're all upset because the baby boomers won't retire. And the millennials and the Gen Zs can't afford to buy houses because of the economy, and they're upset with us too. Northerners act some kind of way about Southerners and vice versa. East Coast people throw shade to the West Coast folks. And the people on both coasts refer to the people in the middle as the flyover states. And the people in the middle refer to themselves as true Americans. We got problems. Left wing and right wing politically got issues with each other. We don't just disagree with each other, we're running each other down. If you are on social media or you watch any kind of news, you know what I'm talking about. In the middle of all the chaos, both in first century Palestine and now in 21st century America, are, though, some committed groups of people who are trying to figure out, like the legal expert, how to be the people of God. What does it mean to be the church? Who are we? How do we worship and be a community? And like the legal expert, we keep trying to make things just a little more difficult than they really need to be, right? Back when Sarah held up easy peasy lemon squeezy, which I got from Cheryl, Jesus was just trying to say, love your neighbor. Don't make it so complicated. You're overthinking it. And the legal expert wants to find a loophole, right? Like, wow, when you say love your neighbor, who do you mean? Like, do you mean the Samaritans? Because, that ain't right. Or do you mean the Gentile pagans? Because also, really, they persecute us. Are the Romans? You don't mean the Romans. Gosh, no. You don't mean them. No. They threw bones in our temple, those Samaritans. We can't deal with them. What do you actually mean when you say? And Jesus is like, it's not that complicated. You're overthinking it. So, what I've heard a lot in our congregation as we've been navigating these months and months since Pastor John retired, I've heard a lot of people talk about why we started coming here in the beginning. The most common answer to this is, I heard John Burns preach. How many people started coming here because they heard John Burns preach? I'm going to raise my hand. That's why we started coming here. John helped me through a crisis. Pastor John baptized my children. He didn't baptize me. He baptized my children, dedicated my babies. They buried people. Fantastic. Listen, John Burns was and is a great pastor, preacher, pastoral caregiver, all of it. That's why we initially started coming here. Curtis heard John Burns preach at a DCBC meeting in November 1998. I had finished a year-long interim ministry when Noah was born, and he was about 5 months old at this point. And Kurt brought a physical cassette tape home from the DCBC meeting because he was so moved by John Burns' sermon that he wanted me to hear it. Because I was sort of in that space of like, do we have to go? Do we have to find a church? Maybe we're okay. Do we have to go to church? He wanted me to hear it. And we listened to that sermon in a car trip because we were in a car that still had a cassette tape player, right? That's how long ago it was. And in the sermon, Mark McIntyre was playing the organ for this meeting. And in the sermon, John starts off by saying, and Mark tore it up. It's a big fancy organ at First Baptist DC. And you listen to Mark say, Mark tore it up. It was incredible. And John Burns said, wasn't that incredible? I get to listen to Mark McIntyre every week. And that's why Kurt and I started coming here. And I know you all have stories. We've heard a lot of those stories. I've heard those stories about why we came here and what keeps us here. Pastor John used to say, I'm sure you've heard it, that he would describe our church as an introverted church. I don't think that's right. I don't think we're introverted. I think John said that because he was introverted. I think we're kind of an avoidant church. We want everybody to get along, and I think we're a little worried if we talk too much about all the different differences we've got, we might not all get along so great anymore. We have a lot of diversity. We have a lot of differences, and if we really get on into the middle of it, the center might not hold because John Burns was the center. But do you know what else John Burns used to say? We have nothing in common but Jesus. I think that was right some days. We have a lot of a diversity that we're very proud of, and rightfully so. We're an amazing congregation, but without John Burns, I'm afraid, and I'm going to own this for myself, the center will not hold. And it's just a matter of time before we spin out. That's my fear. I don't want that. I don't want that for us. I don't want that for me. I don't want that for our amazing children who come every week. The youth group, I pulled high school seniors up today to support 1st through 5th graders to help do this. That's how beautiful they are. But I need to name that place. It's an anxious place for me, and I want to talk about it with you. It's the wilderness. I feel like I'm in the wilderness here, and I don't know if you feel like that too. We're the Hebrews, camping in tents, looking for directions, trying to pull up a GPS. We don't know where we're going. We're in this in-between time right now, and we aren't really sure we're going to come out where we want to be, but we're living on the hope that it's going to be great, that we're going to get there. But it's right now is an anxious, exhausting place. I know this interim process has been confusing and frustrating. I want us to find a new pastor. And also, it's an important time for us to figure out who we are and why we are. And can we hold it together? It's a complicated time for us. We've had some hiccups, for sure. There are so many good, committed people here working hard to move us toward a new pastor. We will get there, but we have to sit in this place of discomfort for a little bit and learn some things about ourselves. I think this is a time to ask some questions, now that John Burns isn't here to guide us. I have questions. Like in 2020, why didn't we put up a Black Lives Matter banner out front? Do we not agree on that? I don't know. We didn't talk about it. I would like to have talked about it. We could still talk about it. When John Burns was doing his series of sermons on LGBT inclusion, we talked about having a vote about becoming a welcome and affirming church, and we never did it. Why didn't we do it? I don't know. Is there a concern that we can't navigate that now that John Burns is gone? Can we navigate it now that John Burns is gone? I'm passionate about both these questions. And I bet you all are passionate about both these questions. And I do not assume you all agree with me. I wish you did. I wish everybody agreed with me, but that isn't the way the world works. I have children. People disagree with me all the time. But I think we love Jesus enough to talk about it and disagree about it and figure it out. Figure out a path forward. And I think you do too, or you wouldn't still be here. It'll be messy and complicated, like the Good Samaritan, like Jesus and the legal expert. But I want to be a church that doesn't turn away from difficult conversations. What else are we avoiding because we're worried the sinner won't hold? In every PowerPoint I create, whether it fits or not, I work in a quote. And it's this one. It's a quote from Joseph Campbell, who wrote about myths and stories and was not a Christian. And he said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." I've literally worked this into budget conversations. It doesn't fit at all, but I feel like everyone needs to see this quote. But actually, this is the quote that is put together for social media. That what Joseph Campbell actually said is better. It is by going down into the abyss that we recover the treasures of life. Where you stumble, there lies your treasure. The very cave you are afraid to enter turns out to be the source of what you're looking for. The thing in the cave that was so dreaded has become the center. Here in this wilderness of transition, we will find our treasure. We all know that treasure is Jesus. We're going to become and move into a great place. And this incredible community of committed believers all want to be a light in the world. We all want to be the Good Samaritan. I want to be the Good Samaritan. Jesus wants us to be the Good Samaritan, but too often, I'm the priest or the Levite. Fear and anxiety keeps us in the shoes of the priest and the Levite. But Jesus shines the light for us to face our fears and anxieties and be the congregation we're called to be. I was a little fearful to preach this sermon today, I'll tell you. Cheryl heard part of it. Y'all know I tell Cheryl everything half the time anyways. I had to check it out with Cheryl before we did it. I want to go into that cave with you all and find the pearl of great price, the treasure that is true inclusion of all people, a radical commitment to social justice, and a deep and sustaining spiritual practice and worship that feeds our souls. I believe we can do it, and I want to do it with you. Amen.